Thanksgiving used to mean warmth and laughter. But this year, my son Brian raised his glass and announced to everyone, "Dad, after dessert, we've arranged a ride straight to Willow Creek Nursing Home." The room froze. Even my own daughter wouldn't meet my eyes. For a moment, I tasted the bitterness of being cast aside by the family I built from nothing. I didn't shout. I simply looked at them all, nodded, and quietly placed my napkin down, because what they didn't know is I had already prepared for this day. Their decision wasn't the end of my story. It was just the start of theirs. If you want to know how a father turns betrayal into justice, keep watching till the end. And let me know what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far my story reaches. The scent of cinnamon and nutmeg clung to the air inside my car as I pulled into Brian's driveway. The pie sat on the passenger seat, still warm in the dish my late wife always used. It was her recipe, our family's Thanksgiving tradition. For years, she'd baked it with love, laughter, and that humming tune only she could hum without driving me nuts. Now, I was the keeper of the pie and the memories that came with it. Their house stood sharp and polished, a sterile kind of perfection. Modern stonework, glass windows, expensive cars in the driveway, but none of it felt like home. I stepped out, balancing the pie and a small envelope tucked inside my coat. The evening air was crisp, biting gently at my cheeks, and somewhere deep down, I felt it. This Thanksgiving would be different. Inside, the laughter was loud but not inviting. Monica greeted me with a nod. No hug, no "Happy Thanksgiving," just a mechanical smile that didn't reach her eyes. Brian walked by with a quick pat on my back, barely glancing up from his phone. "Glad you made it, Dad," he mumbled. The dining room sparkled with gold-trimmed plates and tall candles. The table stretched long and wide, like it was built to keep people apart. They placed me at the far end, far from the center, far from the children, far from anything that mattered. I set the pie down carefully and eased into my chair, my knees complaining more than usual. No one looked my way. I watched as the turkey was served, the children's laughter mixing with Monica's light chuckle and Brian's low murmur. The room was alive, but I wasn't part of it. I was a painting on the wall, present but invisible. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. "Don't make assumptions," I whispered to myself, like my wife used to tell me. Then came the moment. Brian tapped his glass, a casual rhythm that echoed across the table. Forks paused. Conversations quieted. He stood, smiling as though he were about to share good news. "Before dessert," he said, raising his glass, "I'd like to say something important." A few heads turned. "Dad," he began, looking straight at me now. "After dessert, we've arranged transport to Willow Creek Nursing Home. It's time." My breath caught. The room went silent, awkwardly, painfully silent. One of the grandkids giggled, unaware. Monica reached for her wine glass. No one else looked at me. No one asked if I knew, if I agreed. It wasn't a conversation. It was a sentence. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto the plate. The pie in front of me sat untouched. My mouth was dry, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I said nothing. I just watched them all. The way Monica sipped her wine, the way Brian adjusted his collar, already moving on. Then came the second blow. Brian cleared his throat. "Oh, and your things were already moved yesterday." The finality of it landed with a dull thud inside me. This wasn't a decision made in haste. It was planned, executed, behind my back. I looked down at my napkin, slowly folded it, and wiped the corners of my mouth with as much grace as I could gather. My hands were steady, though my insides trembled. "Well," I said, voice calm, deliberate. "You've prepared well." Brian raised an eyebrow. "But," I added, standing slowly, "so have I." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd carried in years. No one spoke. They thought I was bluffing, that I had no fight left in me. They were wrong. I didn't say more. I didn't need to. I left the pie where it sat, untouched, unwanted. My wife's recipe didn't belong here anymore. Let them eat it cold. At the doorway, I paused and looked back one last time. They all watched, unsure of what came next. The pie's still warm, I said, adjusting my coat. You'll need it more than I do. I turned and walked out. The front door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. My shoes scraped the walkway as I stepped into the cool Maryland night, the scent of roasted turkey still clinging to my jacket like a ghost of a celebration I was no longer welcome at. I didn't look back. The pie, her pie, sat untouched on the table, and for the first time in years, I left something behind that mattered. Street lights flickered on across the cul-de-sac. The sound of children laughing from nearby houses filtered through the air, as though the world hadn't shifted under my feet. Thanksgiving lived on in other homes. Mine had ended at the tap of a wine glass. I made it halfway down the driveway when I heard it. Quick footsteps, hesitant but determined. "Grandpa," I turned. Emily stood there, a hoodie over her dress, eyes wide and shining under the porch light. Her breath puffed in soft clouds. "Are you really going to the nursing home?" she asked. I studied her. 16, too young to know how families fracture, but old enough to recognize the ache of betrayal. "Not tonight," I said, my voice steady. "Not ever, if I can help it." She exhaled, shoulders slumping in relief. "I heard them. You know, a few weeks ago, in the garage. They were planning it. They said it'd be easier to do it all at once, that you'd fight if they told you early." I nodded slowly. They were right, but planning doesn't make it right. We stood in silence for a moment, then I jingled the keys in my pocket. "Walk with me?" She nodded, and together we walked to the old Ford truck that had outlived 2 snowstorms, a flooded basement, and now, apparently, my usefulness as a father. I didn't have a destination. I just drove. The streetlights passed like slow blinks. Emily sat beside me, hands in her lap, the kind of quiet that meant thinking, not fear. "You know," I said, "when your grandmother passed, I almost sold this truck. Thought I'd never need to drive long distances again. Then Brian needed help with his mortgage. I put off retirement, worked an extra 4 years so he could keep that house." Emily looked over, lips parted slightly. "He never paid me back," I added. "Never even brought it up." She shifted. "Mom says you gave them the house." I smiled faintly. "That's what they think. But I never signed the deed over. It's still in my name. Guess they didn't check too closely." Her eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what?" I kept my eyes on the road. Brian always thought paperwork was for lawyers. Turns out, sometimes it's what saves you. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the weight of understanding falling into place. A soft buzz came from my jacket pocket. I pulled over and fished out my phone. "Tom," I said, glancing at the screen. "Your lawyer friend?" Emily asked. "Cousin of your grandmother. Used to practice estate law before he retired. Helped me set up the trust years ago," I answered. "Hey," Tom said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Just wanted to check in. I read the trust documents again last night. Just a reminder, you're still fully protected. No one can act without your consent unless a court says otherwise, and they'd have to get past me first." "Thanks, Tom," I replied, glancing at Emily, who leaned closer, trying to hear. "I know tonight probably hurt," he continued, "but just know, you're not alone in this, and you've got options." We exchanged a few more pleasantries before I hung up. Emily stared at me. "You have a trust?" she asked. I nodded. "Your grandmother was thorough and cautious. She worried I'd be too forgiving someday." We sat there in the parked truck for a few seconds longer, the hum of the engine grounding us. "You could stay at my friend Megan's place," Emily offered suddenly. "Her grandma passed last year. The basement apartment's still empty. Megan says her dad hasn't decided what to do with it yet." I hesitated. "I don't want to inconvenience anyone." "You'd be helping me?" she said quickly. "If they know where you are, they'll try again, but if you lay low for a bit, maybe you can figure out my next move." I finished. She smiled. I nodded slowly. "All right, but first, a quick stop." We pulled into a quiet strip mall where an old post office still had a drop box out front. I scribbled a note on hotel stationery I'd kept from a trip years ago. Something about the irony made me grin. "You made a decision for me," I wrote. "Now I'll make mine. We'll talk soon." with witnesses. I slid the envelope into the box and got back into the truck. Emily didn't ask what I wrote. She didn't need to. Later, at Megan's house, she led me down into the basement. It smelled faintly of cedar and laundry detergent. As she unpacked the few things I'd grabbed from the truck, I took off my coat and something slipped from the inner pocket. A sealed envelope. The handwriting stopped me cold. Delicate curves. Familiar loops. It was hers. I hadn't seen it before, or maybe I had, and chose to forget. My late wife's name stared up at me. A letter. A goodbye. Something in me stilled. The envelope trembled in my hands, heavier than it had any right to be. I didn't rush. Emily had gone upstairs, her quiet footsteps fading above me. The basement was silent but for the ticking of a cheap wall clock and the soft hum of a space heater in the corner. I sat on the edge of the pull-out cot, letting my fingers trace the curves of her handwriting on the front of the envelope. My name, written in the way only she ever wrote it. No one else curved the Y like that. When I slid the flap open, her scent rose like a memory. Lavender and orange peel. She used to tuck sachets into our dresser drawers, insisting that life should smell like comfort. My eyes stung before I even saw the first word. If you're reading this, it means I'm not there to say it all out loud. It started gently. Reminders of our first Thanksgiving. The way we burned the turkey but laughed anyway. She wrote about Brian's baby laugh, about how I used to dance with him in the kitchen with gravy stains on my shirt, but the warmth shifted, the ink darkened. I tried to talk to you about Brian. You always thought I was being too harsh, but I watched our son change, and I worried about how much you gave and how little he learned to give back. I stopped reading, just for a moment. The words hung in the air like judgment. But they weren't cruel. They were careful. They were what I hadn't let myself think. I stared at the wall, blinking back the sting in my chest. Maybe she'd seen it long before I did. Maybe love had made me blind, and loss had forced me to open my eyes. Then, I turned the page over and saw the key, taped with worn medical tape. A small brass key sat there, labeled in her handwriting, for the cedar chest, attic. The chest we hadn't opened since before she got sick. I remembered hauling it up to the attic myself, thinking it was too full of old keepsakes to be of use. She'd made me promise not to throw it out. There are documents you'll need, she wrote, and names you may not remember. One of them is Deborah Blake. She knows where the rest is. If you reach this point, it means you need to finish what I started. I said her name out loud. Deborah. It floated in the room like a question. I hadn't thought of her in years, not since she'd helped arrange hospice care for my wife's aunt, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a memory like a filing cabinet. My wife had trusted her. That was enough for me. The words in the letter slowed down after that, turning back to softness. I love you, I always did, but if you're still trying to protect people who don't protect you, it's time to choose a new kind of courage. I hope you found it. The room blurred as I folded the letter shut. For the first time in months, maybe years, I spoke aloud in a way that wasn't habit or rehearsal. I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner, I whispered. But I will now. I promise. The air downstairs had grown stale. I stood up and stepped outside, barefoot on the cold cement just beyond the back door. The stars above Maryland were faint, filtered through suburban light. But I looked up anyway. Somewhere, she was up there, probably rolling her eyes at how slow I'd been to catch on. The neighborhood had gone to sleep. No more laughter, no more carving knives scraping plates, only the hush that follows family dinners and forgotten pies. I breathed in the chill until it stung my lungs. I waited too long when you were alive, I murmured to the wind. I won't make that mistake again. Inside, I dug through my old wallet until I found the tattered address book I hadn't touched in over a decade. Deborah's name wasn't on the first few pages, but it was there, page 9, under the B's. A landline number, probably still attached to a corded phone. It rang twice before a cautious voice answered. Hello? Deborah, this is... I hesitated. This is Harold Ellis. My wife was Margaret. A pause, then, "I was told to expect this." My grip on the phone tightened. "She mentioned you in a letter. Said you had something." "I do," Deborah replied. "She gave it to me 7 years ago. Sealed. Said I'd know when to give it to you." My knees nearly buckled. I sank back onto the cot. "She wrote that?" "She did." Deborah's voice was calm, but not unkind. "She said if you called, you'd be ready to finish what she started." "I am," I said quietly. We arranged to meet the next afternoon. She lived across the state now, tucked away in a small lakeside town near Deep Creek. It would take a few hours to get there, but I'd leave early. Before I hung up, she added one last thing. "She told me you might be afraid to do this alone, but you won't have to. You'll understand when you get here." After the call, I folded the letter and slid it into my wallet, right where I used to keep her photo, faded now from years of overhandling. It felt like I was carrying her voice next to my heart. I thought the letter ended the story. Turns out, it was only page 1. I left before Emily woke up. The sun was still low, casting long slivers of light across the frost-glazed road. I drove with both hands on the wheel, not because I needed to, but because I needed something to hold on to. The directions were handwritten on the back of my wife's letter. Deborah Blake, Route 7, Old White Farmhouse, Blue Shutters. I hadn't heard that name in decades. The countryside rolled past my window, barren trees and weathered barns standing like sentinels to another time. With each mile, the memory of my wife's voice, her message from the night before, echoed louder. Don't let our legacy die in courtrooms and bank ledgers. What legacy, and what had she hidden? When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the house looked exactly like she'd described years ago, in one of her quiet recollections over tea, a place she once said reminded her of college days, of freedom before motherhood swallowed her whole. Deborah answered the door before I even knocked. She was in her early 60s now, sharp gray bob, wearing a thick wool cardigan and a look that said she'd been expecting me longer than I'd known I'd be coming. "You look just like you did in that Christmas card," she said gently, just with more grief around the eyes. I didn't know how to respond, so I nodded. She stepped aside, and I walked into a kitchen that smelled of nutmeg, cedar, and something unspoken. Photos lined the walls, old Polaroids, faded snapshots of college girls in flared jeans. My wife smiled out of more than one of them. "You were her confidant," I said finally. "For longer than you might think," she replied. "We were roommates, sisters in every way except blood. She told me things she never had the courage to say to you." I stood quietly, absorbing that. Then she pulled out a small metal box from a cupboard. It looked out of place next to the ceramic mugs and herbal tea tins. "She gave this to me 7 years ago, told me to give it to you if anything ever happened to her. Said I shouldn't open it, and I didn't." My hands trembled slightly as I accepted it. The lock clicked open with a symbol of an old key taped behind her letter. Inside was more than I could process at once. A second will, dated a full year after the one Brian had shown the lawyer. Letters my wife had handwritten, documenting conversations with Brian, her suspicions, the threats she never told me about, a USB stick labeled Kitchen Cam 2018, and a birth certificate, someone named Carla Monroe, born 1980. The name circled in red ink. I looked up at Deborah. She spoke slowly, like each word was a needle threading a fragile truth. She told me she feared how far Brian might go, but she also feared telling you. Said you'd always see him as the boy who used to ride on your shoulders, never the man he'd become. She was right. I defended him more times than I could count. We plugged in the USB to Deborah's old laptop. The video was grainy, but the audio was clear. Brian, in our kitchen, red-faced, yelling. "If you don't sign the house over now, don't expect to be invited to anything again. I'll make sure of it." I recognized that day. She'd said she was too tired for our anniversary dinner. I never knew why. "Do you want to keep this?" Deborah asked, her eyes brimming. I nodded. "All of it." Before I left, she handed me one more item, an old CD. "She called me the night she recorded this voicemail," she whispered. "Said you'd need to hear it." I sat in my truck and slid it into the player. Her voice filled the cab, soft but clear. "If you're hearing this, I hope you'll finally see him the way I did. Don't let our legacy be divided up by the ungrateful. Protect what we built, and forgive me for not telling you sooner." I stared ahead, the farmland stretching quiet and endless in front of me. My fingers gripped the wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. I'd come looking for answers, but now I had a mission. The name circled on that birth certificate, Carla, burned in my mind. I didn't know who she was, but I would. I turned the key in the ignition. The GPS took me through winding streets toward Annapolis. The roads grew narrower, neighborhoods quieter, until I reached a cul-de-sac where the houses looked like they were holding their breath. The number on the mailbox matched what was scribbled on the folded page of the second will, 4118 Rosemere Drive. I killed the engine and sat for a moment. Who was Carla? I stepped out, holding the metal box from Deborah like it might open again and explain everything. The house was a modest one-story, with faded yellow siding and an empty driveway. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I waited. Then I knocked. Still nothing. But just as I turned to leave, I saw a sliver of movement through the blinds. A flick, a shadow pulling back. Someone was inside. I walked back to the truck and sat there for 10 minutes. Then I tried again. This time, the front door creaked open when I pushed it. Unlocked. Quiet. Still. "Hello?" I called softly. "Carla?" No response. Inside. The air was dry and smelled like old paper. Boxes lined the hallway, some sealed, some gaping open. Family photos filled the walls, most of them dusty. But one stopped me cold. It was a photo of my wife, young, maybe in her 20s, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. A little girl stood between them, holding their hands. They looked like a family. And not just any family, my wife's family. On a side table near the kitchen was an envelope, to be opened only if he comes. I opened it slowly, as if the paper itself might change everything. If you're reading this, I'm at Hillcrest Cemetery, Section B, under the tree with the cracked stone angel. That's where it all started. I didn't want to drag you into this. But she would have wanted you to know the truth. She was my sister. Half-sister. And Brian? He knew. I had to sit down. Half-sister? Memories came back in flashes. A summer in the early 80s when my wife disappeared for a week. Said she'd gone to visit an old friend. She came back quiet. Sad. I never asked. I'd been too busy working double shifts back then. I stared at the picture again. That girl between them. Was she Carla's daughter? Or was she someone else entirely? The sun was lowering when I pulled into Hillcrest Cemetery. The cracked stone angel wasn't hard to find. Beneath it sat a woman with silver-streaked hair, wrapped in a gray coat, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She didn't look up as I approached. "You found the letter," she said quietly. I did. We stood in silence. The wind stirred the dry leaves around our feet. "She didn't tell you," Carla finally said, her voice fragile but even. She wanted to. "But she thought it would change the way you saw her." "It wouldn't have," I replied, though I wasn't sure that was true. "She and I had the same father. He had two families. Mine was the one he left behind." She motioned to the gravestone. It bore the name Robert Ellis, and below it, 2 dates and the simple phrase, "Father to some, unknown to others." Carla reached into her purse and handed me a folder. "Brian found out about me, about the birth certificate. Your wife didn't think he'd do anything, but..." Inside were copies of letters, threatening, anonymous, typed in bold block font. "No one will believe your claim. Go back to where you came from. No blood, no rights." "I believe they were from Brian," she said. "Or someone he paid. After your wife died." The threats stopped, but I always felt watched. My throat tightened. He hadn't just turned on me. He had tried to erase the people his mother loved. "I thought you were the shadow," I admitted. "But now I realize she was trying to protect both of us, and I kept looking away." Carla looked at me then. "You don't have to fix the past, but maybe you can stop him from rewriting it." I stood there for a long time after she left, watching the light fade over that cracked angel. The photo, the letters, the truth, all of it demanded action. Brian didn't just betray me, he tried to erase our family's story. And now, he'll face all of it. The morning air in Annapolis carried a strange weight, like the quiet before a storm. I parked outside Gerald Marks's law office again, but this time, I didn't come in mourning. I came armed. The second will, the USB, Carla's letter, and those anonymous threats. All of it sat neatly inside my worn leather folder. My fingers brushed over the clasp before I walked in. The receptionist recognized me, hesitated, and said, "Mr. Marks is with someone, but I'll let him know you're here." She didn't ask if I had an appointment. I didn't offer one. Within 5 minutes, Gerald opened his door, his eyes falling to the folder in my hands before they met mine. "Mr. Graham," he said, the warmth forced. "I wasn't expecting. No one ever is," I said. "But I think we should talk." His office hadn't changed, but my gaze did. I scanned everything now, every certificate, every document tray. What had he known? What had he ignored? I sat, unsnapped the folder. One by one, I laid them out like cards on a table. First, the second will, signed and dated after the first. Gerald's eyes narrowed. Second, Carla's letter. He didn't recognize her name, or pretended not to. Third, copies of threatening notes mailed to Carla's home. And last, the USB. I didn't speak. I waited. And finally, he cracked. "Brian came to me," he admitted, voice low, as if afraid the walls might hear. A few weeks before the funeral, he said everything was in order, pressed me to move quickly, get probate filed. He presented the first will as the final one. I didn't question it. "You didn't question anything?" I asked, calm but steel in my voice. "Not even when the woman you supposedly represented wasn't here to confirm a word of it?" He flinched. "I should have done more due diligence," he muttered. "You didn't just fail her," I said. "You empowered him." He sank back in his chair as I plugged in the USB. The screen lit up. My wife appeared, frail but clear-eyed. The timestamp was 3 months before her death. "I'm of sound mind," she said, "and I've amended my estate plan. Brian has shown behavior that concerns me. I reaffirm that my husband remains the sole executor. Carla is to be acknowledged as my half-sister, and she is to receive what I outlined in the revised will." Gerald paled. Then came the final part. "If you're watching this," she added, "I've stored all original documents in the safe deposit box at Chesapeake Bank, box 1182, key in my cedar chest. Trust no one until you've opened it." Gerald reached for his glasses, visibly rattled. "Well?" I asked. "I'll file a motion immediately," he said, "to suspend the current probate and seek judicial review of the second will. We'll also freeze any asset transfers in process." "One more thing," I added. "I want a forensic audit. Every transfer, account change, check signed or money moved in the last 60 days, especially anything Brian touched." He blinked, but nodded. "Understood." When I left his office, the sky had turned gray. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already here, but for the first time, I felt like I was facing it on my feet. I sat in my truck and stared at the USB still in my hand. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the notification, $25,000 withdrawn from checking. From an account Brian should have never had access to. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. He was still playing, still moving pieces I didn't even know were on the board. And this time, I wouldn't just react, I'd strike. When I got home, the sun had begun to sink behind the tall maples lining our old street. I locked the front door out of instinct, though I wasn't sure who I was keeping out anymore. Brian, or the shadow of the man I used to be before all this began. My hands moved quickly, methodically, as I opened my laptop, logged into every bank account, credit union, and retirement portfolio I had. One by one, I reset passwords, locked down transfers, enabled two-step verification. Carla hadn't answered my call. Instead, a text. I'm still thinking, don't come here. But I knew silence wasn't rejection. Not from her, not after everything. So I got in my truck and drove straight to the address I'd looked up weeks ago but never dared visit. Her workplace. It was a small medical clinic tucked between a laundromat and a florist, just off Main Street in Annapolis. I parked across the street and waited, watching patients come and go until the light inside the clinic dimmed. Then, through the glass doors, I saw her, my daughter. She stood behind the reception counter, her hair tied up, coat folded over her arm. She spotted me instantly. Her body froze. I didn't move. I just stood there, waiting. Eventually, she stepped outside. Her eyes darted past me, then back. Her voice, when it came, was barely above the wind. You shouldn't be here. I brought something, I said, and held out the flash drive. You need to see it. It's Mom. She didn't take it at first. It's her voice. A video. She talks about Brian. About Carla. About everything. Carla looked at the USB like it might burn her fingers. But then, slowly, she took it. I wanted to believe you, she whispered. But every time Brian talks, I forget what Mom sounded like. She didn't hug me, didn't say goodbye, just turned and walked to her car. I stood there for a long while after she left, long enough for the florist to turn off their lights, long enough for the weight in my chest to settle somewhere deeper. On the drive home, I turned off the radio and just listened to my thoughts. What a cruel thing. I thought, how lies don't just break trust. They mute love. They take your memories and make you doubt even those. I couldn't blame Carla for needing space. She hadn't betrayed me the way Brian did. She just got tired of choosing between loyalty and survival. When I reached the porch, a FedEx envelope sat at the foot of the door. No knock, no warning. My name printed neatly across the front. Inside, a legal letter from Brian's attorney. Formal language, cold phrases. Accelerated inheritance restructuring. Urgent need for power of attorney. Concerns about mental clarity. I stared at the date at the top. 3 weeks ago, before the funeral. My pulse thudded in my ears. The letter referenced a psychological assessment supposedly administered to me, one I had never agreed to, never heard of. Brian wasn't just stealing money. He was building a case to erase me entirely, legally, financially, even mentally. I didn't throw the letter away. I scanned it, saved a copy, then dialed Gerald Marks. He answered on the third ring. I need emergency legal action, I said. Also, I want a mental health evaluation, certified by a doctor I choose. There was a pause. I'll arrange both, Gerald said. And, I'm sorry. No, I said. Not yet, but you will be. That night, I began recording everything, every phone call, every transaction, every receipt. My kitchen counter became a war room. Labeled folders, timestamps, a journal I hadn't touched in 5 years, now filled with my wife's voice and my son's threats. They wanted to prove I was unfit, but they were the ones about to hear from a man who'd spent 70 years watching, listening, and enduring. Late into the night, just as I finished cataloging the USB contents again, my phone buzzed. It was Carla. I picked up immediately. She didn't say hello, just 4 words. Dad, I watched the video. I opened my mouth, but the line had already gone dead. I stared at the screen. Her voice was shaking, not from fear, something deeper. Maybe she remembered the truth. The text from Carla came just after noon. Come for Sunday dinner. Everyone will be there. No explanation, no apology. Just an invitation that felt like an olive branch, maybe even redemption. I stood in my study, the USB drive and second will laid out in front of me, alongside a printed list of every suspicious transaction Brian had authorized in the last 60 days. Part of me wanted to believe Carla had finally taken a stand, that she had watched the video, that maybe this was her way of saying, "You were right, Dad, let's fix this." I packed everything in a manila folder, zipped up my jacket, and made the quiet drive to her house. The wind was picking up, blowing leaves across the street like memories trying to escape the season. When I arrived, Carla's house looked calm, too calm. The curtains were drawn, but the porch light was on, even though it was broad daylight. I knocked, and the door opened almost instantly. Brian greeted me with that politician's smile of his. "Frank," he said, like we were old poker buddies. "Glad you came." Inside, the living room was staged like a reunion. Aunt May sat stiffly on the floral couch, clutching her purse like it contained the last truth left in the world. The grandkids were watching something in the next room, their laughter muffled by the thick air of adult intentions. Carla stood in the kitchen, arms folded, eyes avoiding mine. "Let's talk as a family," Brian said, gesturing to the dining table. "No need for lawyers or outside drama." Something was wrong. The way they were all positioned. The way Carla didn't even glance up. It wasn't dinner, it was theater. I took my seat slowly. Brian reached into a folder on the table and pulled out a document. "We've been concerned, Frank, really concerned, about your mental well-being." Aunt May nodded solemnly. "You've been unstable since the funeral. Obsessive." Brian slid the document across the table. "It's just a letter, from all of us. An agreement that you'll take a break from managing things while we get clarity." Carla and Aunt May already signed. I scanned it quickly. A family intervention letter, full of carefully crafted language. Psychological fatigue, emotional disorientation, temporary delegation of authority. I looked at Carla. "Did you even watch the video?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands trembled. She didn't speak. Aunt May interjected. "She watched it, but that doesn't erase 20 years of your stubbornness, Frank." Brian leaned in, voice low and rehearsed. "This is about protecting you, and the family. You don't have to fight anymore." I stared at the letter. Then I opened my folder. I reached for the reconciliation agreement Brian had given me and flipped it open. Nestled inside, behind the top page, was another sheet. Power of attorney transfer, of course. Without a word, I pulled out my phone and tapped record. "My name is Frank Miller," I said clearly. "I'm here under false pretenses, being coerced into signing legal documents under emotional pressure by my son-in-law, Brian, and members of my family. I am of sound mind." Chaos erupted. Brian lunged across the table, reaching for the phone. Aunt May gasped, her voice shrill. Carla stood frozen as her husband shouted, "Turn that off!" But I was already on my feet. I didn't yell, didn't cry. I simply slipped the phone into my jacket, picked up my folder, and walked toward the door. "Dad," Carla called, but it wasn't a question or a plea, just a name echoing into guilt. I didn't look back. Driving home, the air felt heavier than before. I remembered something my wife had once written in her diary, something I hadn't understood at the time. The people who hurt you most often sit closest at the dinner table. That night, I copied the video, the will, and the list of transactions. I mailed them to 3 people, Gerald Marks, my wife's old pastor, and a journalist from her hometown newspaper. Then I reread the family intervention letter. My hands froze. One signature didn't match, Aunt May's. She was old, but her signature was always tight and precise. The one on the letter was loose, shaky, a forgery. They had faked her consent. Late that evening, I stood at a payphone in the parking lot of an old gas station, the kind no one uses anymore. I dialed the number I had dug out of a drawer, Carla's college roommate, a journalist now, someone my wife had always trusted. When she picked up, I said only this. They wanted a quiet little family meeting. They forgot what happens when you trap a man who has nothing left to lose. I didn't expect Helen Ryder's voice to sound exactly the same after all these years. Clear, sharp, no wasted syllables. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I remember you from Carla's wedding. If even half of what you sent me is true, people need to hear it. We agreed to meet at a diner off Route 50, neutral ground, away from whispers and family ghosts. I brought a printout of the second will, a still image from the video of my wife, and a photograph of her on our last vacation together. I wasn't trying to prove she loved me. I just needed Helen to see her the way I did. She ordered coffee, black, no sugar. Then she listened. I laid it all out. Carla's silence, Brian's manipulation, the forged intervention letter, the hidden safe deposit box. Helen didn't interrupt, didn't blink much. She just nodded now and then, pen moving across a yellow legal pad. "You know," she said finally, tapping her pen, "Brian once applied to intern at our station, got rejected after a background check. Something never sat right with me about him." I raised an eyebrow. "What did they find?" She leaned back. "Can't say for sure, but I'll dig." Before we parted, she asked, "Would you go on camera? Full segment. Tomorrow night's news." I hesitated. My instincts screamed to protect, to remain quiet, to let legal papers do their quiet war. But then I remembered Carla's face, how she looked away when I asked if she watched the video. "If I stay silent," I said, "they win." Helen smiled. "Good answer." Back home, I sat at the kitchen table under the soft glow of a worn-out bulb and called Carla. "You're going on TV?" she asked, voice tight. "I am." "Dad, please, don't do this." "Then say it yourself," I said gently. "On air, with me. Say the truth." She didn't respond. The line went dead. The next day at the studio, everything felt sterile. Lights, makeup, countdowns. Helen's producer was kind, but focused. They double-checked my documents, verified every date and timestamp. Their legal team confirmed the second will was legitimate, filed years ago with a now-deceased attorney whose archive had just been unsealed. When the red light turned on, I breathed in slowly. Helen introduced me as a retired postal worker and father who says the fight for his late wife's legacy has turned into a battle for his own name. I told the story calmly, without dramatic flair. My voice cracked once, when I mentioned the video of my wife, her hands folded in her lap, speaking from a place of finality and love. "She knew what Brian was doing," I said. "She knew Carla might not be strong enough to speak, so she did it herself, before the cancer stole her voice." Then Helen's team aired the clip, not of my wife, but from the so-called family meeting. Brian's voice filled the studio. "He's old and confused. Let's just get his signature and be done with it." A silence fell, so loud you could hear the camera operator shift his weight. When the segment ended, I stepped outside. My phone buzzed non-stop, notifications, messages, unknown numbers. Then one name lit up, Carla. Her message was short. "You didn't have to do this." I replied. I waited too long not to. That evening, Helen forwarded me an email from a viewer, a woman who used to work with Brian in another state. In it, she wrote, "He forged documents once, back when his uncle passed, told everyone it was a misunderstanding. I didn't believe him then. I sure as hell don't now." I sat in my recliner, the TV muted, my reflection faint on the black screen. I didn't feel victorious. I felt seen. When Helen called again to ask for a follow-up, I looked at my reflection and finally saw something other than grief in my eyes. "If the truth is finally louder than the lies," I told her, "then maybe I'm not done yet." I hadn't slept since the interview aired. 2 nights had passed, and I was still sitting in that old recliner, watching the broadcast on loop. Not because I needed reassurance. I'd already heard enough strangers call me brave. No, I was watching it because for the first time in months, the silence in this house wasn't just loneliness, it was fuel. Then came the knock, sharp, single. I stood, heart thudding. No car outside, no footsteps, only the night breeze rustling the hedge. At my feet was a white envelope, unmarked. Inside was a single piece of paper. "Old men shouldn't stir old dust. Stop now, for your own sake." Folded within that note was something worse. A photo, torn in 4. My wife and I, decades ago. She in that blue sundress she loved. Me holding her hand in front of the Chesapeake Bay. The edges were burned. Someone had taken their time. I locked the door, turned off every light, and sat with the pieces of that photo like they were a puzzle of my past someone wanted erased. The next morning, I was at the precinct before sunrise. Officer Legrand was younger than me by 2 decades, but carried himself like he'd seen too much to be surprised anymore. When I showed him the note, his expression didn't shift. "You're not the first to mention Brian's name lately," he said, sliding the photo into an evidence sleeve. "After your broadcast, we got an anonymous package, documents from an old case, elder exploitation, died in committee 2 years ago, lack of evidence." I blinked. "So someone's trying to finish it now?" He leaned forward. "Looks that way, but you need to be careful. Families like yours, they hide rot under polish." As I left the station, my phone buzzed. Voicemail. Carla. Her voice was brittle, like ice cracking under pressure. "I didn't know about the photo. Dad, they're watching you. Brian's not who you think he is. Please be careful." That was it. No explanation. No apology. I played it again. And again. Was it fear or warning? That night, just past 11, there was another knock, but this time from my neighbor, Joe, red-faced and panting. "Your backyard, Frank, it's on fire." We sprinted through the fence line. The old shed, where I kept Diana's boxes, some tools, a few of her journals, was engulfed. Flames twisted into the sky like angry hands. The fire department arrived quickly, but the damage was done. As they cleared the charred wood, one firefighter called me over. "Sir, we found this under the wreckage." It was one of my old security cameras, melted around the edges but still recognizable. I had forgotten I even had backups running after the first round of legal threats. The next morning, I brought the half-burnt camera and its drive to Helen and her team. They worked quietly, intently, like surgeons operating on memory. Hours passed. Then Helen tapped the screen. There, a grainy figure, hoodie pulled tight, stepping into the yard. Limping. Left leg dragging slightly, just like Brian after his ACL surgery last winter. Helen didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "This," she finally whispered, "might be enough to open a formal investigation." I nodded. "Then let's finish what they started." By that evening, Officer Legrand called. The police were launching an inquiry, not just into the fire, but everything. The will, the documents, the threats. But that wasn't the only envelope I received that day. A thick manila folder arrived by courier. Inside, a formal lawsuit. Brian was suing me for defamation. Emotional distress, it claimed. Intentional misrepresentation. I read every line, slow and steady. Then I smiled. "Good," I said aloud, placing the suit next to the photo pieces. Now we're both on record. The war had finally become official, and I wasn't afraid of the fire anymore. The phone call came just as I was pouring my second cup of coffee. Helen's voice was electric with purpose. "Frank, the network is going live. Town hall format. You'll be on stage. Brian too. Can you do it?" I hesitated, then nodded before I realized she couldn't see me. "I'll be there," I said. Helen paused. "You've started something. Frank, people want answers. They deserve them." By the time I arrived at the community center, the parking lot was already full. Inside, folding chairs stretched in neat rows. Faces, many lined by age, others young but wary, looked up as I entered. Helen was already moving with the urgency of someone putting out fires. The stage lights glinted off her hair as she introduced herself to the moderator, set out folders, and reviewed notes. On the far side of the stage sat Brian, suit pressed and hair sharp, muttering quietly with his lawyer. He caught my eye, held the stare for a beat, then turned away. At the edge of the audience, I spotted Carla, shrinking into her seat, twisting a handkerchief in her lap. On a table near Helen were documents, photos, printed emails, and a small monitor cued to show the grainy, incriminating footage from my burnt shed. The broadcast started right on the hour. Helen's voice, clear and commanding, welcomed viewers. Tonight, we gather to talk about family, inheritance, and the hidden epidemic of elder abuse. She didn't waste time. On the monitor, the video played, the hooded figure, the limp, the fire's first flash. Gasps ran through the room. Helen turned to Brian. "Do you recognize the limp in this footage?" Brian shifted, suddenly aware of the cameras. "That's not me. The footage is edited, or you found someone who looks like me," I answered quietly. "You called me confused, but now, the truth is finally speaking for itself." A ripple in the audience. Then, from the middle row, a tall man stood up, waving a cane. "That's Brian. All right. We used to call that the Brian bounce back at the dealership." The energy in the room changed. Another woman, older, in a floral blouse, rose shakily. "He tried to get my son to transfer our house deed to his name. Said it'd save us money. I never trusted him." A chorus of stories followed. Little betrayals, suspicious phone calls, promises never kept. Brian's mask cracked. He accused me of orchestrating a witch hunt, declared it a public spectacle built on lies. Helen looked at him, voice steady. "Sir, you set this fire. The truth just gave it air." That's when Carla stood. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. I wanted to believe him. I thought my dad was just old and confused, but I found documents in our closet. I saw the truth. She turned to the crowd, words picking up strength. "Brian forged Mom's signature. He isolated Dad, destroyed our family, all for money." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "These are recordings. I kept them. Brian made me lie, threatened me. I'm sorry it took me so long." Silence fell, heavy and complete. The broadcast ended. Brian stormed from the stage, his lawyer in tow, face thunderous. Helen came to me, breathless but smiling. "We'll hand the tape to police tonight. This won't end here. Are you ready for court?" Outside, hands found mine, neighbors, strangers, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. Carla waited beside my car, face drawn but lighter. "Dad, let me help. I want to fix this. If you'll let me." I didn't answer right away. Sometimes. Resolve is quieter than forgiveness, but I knew this was only the beginning of the end. There's a strange quiet in a courthouse before dawn, before the corridors fill with words like justice and guilt. I walked those marble floors with my daughter by my side, her grip steady on my arm. She wore her mother's brooch, something old, something loved. I wore my wife's pendant under my shirt, close to my chest. Today, her hand was gone, but everything she'd fought for felt closer than ever. Helen was already waiting at the door, legal folder in hand, a determined smile on her face. "We're not just going to speak truth," she said, eyes sharp. "We're going to prove it." We nodded as one. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Brian sat hunched with a new attorney, arms folded, jaw tight, pretending not to see us. His eyes flickered once, meeting mine, then darted away. Reporters clustered near the door, cameras off but notebooks open, ready to devour whatever scraps would fall from today's table. The hearing began. Carla was called first. Her hands barely trembled as she stood. She pulled a small recorder from her purse, pressed play, and the room filled with Brian's voice, cold, threatening, unmistakable. "You do what I say, or you lose everything. You want to end up like Dad?" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Helen approached the stand next, presenting the technical report matching the man's limp in the backyard fire video to Brian's old knee injury. She made it sound simple, painfully simple. "The gate is unique. Your Honor, it's his." The judge nodded, making notes, expression unreadable. That's when the door in the back of the courtroom opened. A gray-haired woman in a navy blazer approached, hand raised. "Your Honor, if I may?" She was the notary, her testimony calm but damning. "I was present for 2 wills, one authentic, one forged and discarded." Brian Miller attempted to coerce me to notarize both. Brian's attorney objected, but the judge waved him off. "Continue." Evidence piled up, Carla's testimony, the notary's words, the matching video, the threatening letters. I sat silently as truth stacked on truth, brick by brick. Finally, they called me to the stand. I spoke plainly. My wife trusted me to protect our family's legacy. I failed, at first, to see the danger. But I won't fail again. I described the isolation, the gaslighting, the nights I questioned my sanity. I did not cry. Carla did. Though, when I spoke about her mother's fear that love could not save us from lies, Helen handed the judge a final packet, letters from my wife, written in her last year. I know Brian will try to take what isn't his, she wrote. If you're reading this, you know I tried to stop him. Then Carla rose again, walking to the front with a folded piece of paper. There's one more thing, she said quietly, voice clear. My mother gave this to her lawyer friend, just in case. She handed it to the judge. He unfolded the paper and read. The courtroom held its breath. Brian leapt to his feet. You can't do this. The judge silenced him with a glare. It's already done. This is a trust document, signed and witnessed, transferring all assets to Mr. Miller if evidence of fraud or criminal behavior by any beneficiary is uncovered, effective immediately. Brian tried to protest, but it was finished. The judge ruled in my favor. Brian's claims stripped, a criminal investigation pending, and a restraining order issued. Outside, the world felt wide and impossibly bright. Reporters tried to crowd us, but I shook my head. Pushing past the microphones, Carla slipped her hand into mine. Mom knew, she whispered, tears shining. She always knew. Helen smiled, hugging her folders to her chest. You honored her, Frank. A year later, the house is bright with laughter again. Carla visits every weekend with her girls. The roses out front are taller now, thriving in Maryland's unpredictable weather. We garden, we eat, we talk about the past. Sometimes, but not always. Peace isn't forgetting, but learning to rest alongside memory. Helen sends me a link to the network's new special, Inheritance, A Father's Stand. I don't watch it. The real story is here, in these walls, in these hands, in these second chances. Some evenings, I set my wife's pendant on the kitchen table, look at her garden, and close my eyes. People think age means weakness. They think silence means surrender. But I've learned love leaves a legacy, even louder than any will. All it needed was the truth, and someone willing to fight for it.